All right, good morning, everyone. I'm going to go ahead and get started. I am recording this webinar for the benefit of those of us who may not be able to join. So why are you here? If you're attending this webinar, hopefully you're developing or redeveloping a course, either for an online offering or in-person offering or even a hybrid offering. And the goal of this webinar is to walk you through the steps of how to align your course outcomes with all of the materials that you develop for your course. And so regardless of the modality of the course, if it's online, if it's in person, alignment is a critical element to both, achieving a successful course and improving your student outcomes. And what you'll find is it also helps with achieving, student satisfaction as well.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Courtney Abear, and I'll be co-presenting here with Lydia. I'm a learning experience designer with LSU Digital and Continuing Education. We're very glad to have you all here and looking forward to presenting to you this morning.
I failed to introduce myself at the beginning, but I'm Lydia Treadwell. I'm also a learning experience designer. And I just want to tell you briefly about what our role is here at Digital and Continuing Education. We help to develop online courses that are both credit and non-credit courses. And we do this by working with faculty in workshops and also one-on-one to help them develop these either new courses or re-envisioning their current in-person courses for the online offering. So just a couple of directions for this webinar so that you can get the most out of it. Right now I have it set to where everyone is automatically muted. Make sure that you're muted throughout just in case there's any interference sounds that make their way into the webinar. If you do have questions, please write those down. We'll have an opportunity for questions at the end of the webinar. And we do encourage that you get a sheet of paper or perhaps open a Word document on your computer so that as we ask you to think about something or write down an idea for your course, that you have a place to do that. And without further ado, we'll go ahead and get started. So today, I'm going to walk you through the alignment of a real course. At Digital and Continuing Education, our approach to designing courses puts the development of specific outcomes and objectives at the beginning of the process. And this helps to set these benchmarks and helps you align the rest of the course to where they fall in line with the goals that you set at the very beginning. So in this webinar, we'll talk about what alignment is, what the benefit of alignment is, and then we'll walk you through how would you align your course. And I'll use an example throughout the webinar, but also be thinking about the course that you're about to develop or maybe currently developing or maybe want to develop in the future. And then we'll also talk about something called unique course value that can help guide some of those decisions about the course outcomes and objectives as you're aligning your course. So in keeping with our own best practices, the objectives for this webinar, by the end of this webinar, you will be able to write an observable course outcome. We'll talk about what that word observable and measurable means and how to do that. And then we want you to be able to deconstruct that outcome into measurable and specific module learning objectives. Then from there, align assessments to those outcomes and objectives. And then at the end, think about your unique course value and describe what those qualities are that bring value to your students, that students will, the course will really resonate with them even years after they've taken it. So I like to start this alignment discussion with an analogy. Just like you do in your in-person courses or your online courses, it's always nice to try to tie it to something real world. So when you get in your car, you don't just start driving without an end destination in mind. You don't just start driving around aimlessly without a map, without knowing where you're going, because you won't end up where you want to be. And if you end up where you want to be, you may not end up there on time because you didn't plan ahead for a specific way to get there. And so first you want to figure out where it is you want to go. What is your final destination? Once you've determined your final destination, you have to maybe figure out where you are in conjunction to that final destination. And then the next step, you're going to map out how is it that you're going to get from your current starting point to that destination point. So here's where I tie it all together to what we're going to be talking about today. When you're writing your course outcomes and aligning your course, you want to identify what is that final goal or destination. Those are going to be your course outcomes. Then you have to identify or determine where you're at and where your students are at. If it's an introductory sociology course, the types of skills and knowledge that students come into your classroom having beforehand may be far limited in comparison to major courses, 4,000 level courses. So that is something that you also want to consider when you're developing your final destination. And then you have to figure out how to get there. And that's where the alignment portion comes into play. That's where you figure out how you're going to use your assessments, your activities, and your course materials to achieve that final destination. So what is alignment? We've come up with this wonderful puzzle piece illustration, and it really can be a puzzle, and alignment can be puzzling if you've never done it before. But I believe most instructors, most professors have at least a tacit understanding of what alignment is and how it works. But today I'm hoping to give you some really useful skills and strategies to ensure course alignment from your course outcomes to your learning objectives, assessments, so on and so forth. And so alignment is the intentional connection between these outcomes, objectives, assessments, activities, and materials. And if you're teaching a course that's aligned, it means that your stated course goals and learning objectives function in harmony with the activities and assessments that are given to students. It basically makes sure, if your course is aligned, it makes sure that the students have accurate expectations about what will be taught and what they'll be assessed on and in the course. And on the flip side, as an instructor, you are making sure that you have a legitimate line of evidence to assess whether or not students have achieved those larger course outcomes and even the objectives. So it basically just keeps you and your student on the proper path to get to that final destination. And so today we'll start out talking about course outcomes. We'll talk about how to break those down into objectives, how you can use assessments to assess, to determine whether or not those objectives and outcomes have been reached, and then how your activities and course assessment, course materials can support the acquisition of the outcomes, objectives, and assessments. So another example, and this is where alignment maybe didn't go so right. Say you're taking a two-dimensional design class. It's a studio class. It's what a lot of studio art majors take in their first year. And you look at the syllabus, and there's a course outcome stated that says create accurate representations of form in a two-dimensional format. This is the large goal of the class. You read this and you say, I'll be able to draw something that looks somewhat convincing to real life on paper. That sounds great. I want to be able to do that as an artist. And then the objectives for maybe one of the first modules or for the first couple of weeks is you're defining the basic principles of design. So maybe you go through a textbook, or the student gives the professor gives a lecture on line, form, value, shape. You learn what those are, and then you're able to demonstrate what those basic principles look like on pen and paper. So you're going through this course, you're attending these wonderful studio where you're getting some guidance from your instructor in how to apply those different principles of design to your actual work. And then it comes time for your final assessment, your final project. And the professor gives it out, and you see that you're being expected to write a 10-page research paper on a contemporary artist. Is that what you had expected? Not necessarily. Is it related to art? Certainly. It's certainly related to art, and you could get some sort of benefit out of writing a research paper that you could integrate into your own practice. However, it doesn't align with that stated course outcome and the objectives. And so as a student, you may feel lost, you may feel underprepared for this assessment because you haven't been working towards this the entire semester. So in cases where there is misalignment, it makes courses more likely to be fragmented and ineffective, and it gives students mixed messages about what you're teaching versus what you're assessing them on. And oftentimes students will spend time on meaningless activities, and it may cause you to over or underestimate the effectiveness of your own instruction. So let's talk about those course learning outcomes. These course learning outcomes reflect the broad conceptual knowledge and generic skills that students should be able to gain following the successful taking of your course. And they're the overall expectations for what students will want to, what you want students to learn in the course. So as you're thinking about your course outcomes, think about some of those broad areas, those knowledge, skills, abilities that you really focus your instruction on. They don't have to be anything super, super specific, but what are the 3 to 5 major concepts that you really want students walking out there having mastered? You may also want to think about how this course relates to other courses. So if this is an introductory course, how will this course prepare them for future courses in the same subject? Or if this is a capstone course, how do the course outcomes represent that cumulative achievement of those major concepts that they should have at the end of a program? Then you want to think about the level of the course and who are your students. Are they first-time college students? Are they non-traditional students? Are they taking an online course for the first time? These are things that you want to consider, though it may not change, the actual concepts you're assessing them on. It may help you reconsider the level to which you're expecting these students to achieve these outcomes. So I want you all to take a quick moment and think about 2 to 3 topic skills or concepts that really drive your course. What are those major, the meat and potatoes, as we like to say, of your course that you really want students walking out there having mastered? So take about a minute, maybe jot down a couple of ideas, and then towards the end of this webinar, you'll be able to put them all in an alignment map. And this is where I wish I had a musical intermission. All right, so as you are continuing to jot down those ideas, I wanted to introduce you to our example course that we'll be talking about and how we're going to align it today. So say you're the professor for a Psych 3505 forensic psychology course. And since it's a 3000 level course, it's an intermediate course. You'll have students who, this isn't their first rodeo, so to speak. They've taken college courses before, but you're offering it for the first time 100% online. And you just listened to what I told you about, those broad goals, that final destination of the course. And these are the different concepts that you listed. So you want them to have an understanding of foundational concepts of forensic psychology, the role of the forensic psychologist in criminal law, and then you really, one thing that you would absolutely be ashamed of if a student walked out of your class having made an A and wasn't able to demonstrate an effective understanding of, was ethical decision-making models within the field of forensic psychology. So we're going to focus on that third concept as we develop our measurable and observable outcomes. So that those ethical decision-making models will be our jumping off point for the first outcome that we will write. So when we say measurable and observable, this is a very specific set of descriptors for what is the ideal when it comes to these outcomes. So by measurable and observable, how will you be able to determine the mastery of knowledge, skills, or concepts with a direct line of evidence, such as an assessment? So how can you make sure that they know the ethical decision-making models, and how will you assess them on that? And so I just broke my own rule. As you're writing that outcome, you want to avoid verbs and terms that are not specific and can't be measured or observed through a corresponding assessment. We call these soft verbs or not measurable verbs. And these are verbs to know, to appreciate, to understand, grasp the significance of. And I have to admit that when I taught my first course, I had a lot of to understands that were contained in my objectives. And it's because, oh yeah, no, I want them to be able to understand this. But you have to ask yourself, how will you know that they understand it? How will saying one student, we see the different spectrum of students. say, oh yeah, I get it, I understand, but can you actually apply it? To what degree do you want them to understand it? And this is where something like Bloom's taxonomy can be incredibly helpful. Bloom's taxonomy, if you haven't seen it before, is a framework for classifying different ways of thinking about and ordering objectives. So within each cognitive domain, which are these various tiers of the pyramid from bottom to top, Bloom categorizes and orders thinking skills and objectives from lower order, such as remember and understand, to higher order thinking skills, such as create and evaluate. So when you're trying to choose that measurable and observable verb to contextualize your outcome, go to Bloom's taxonomy first. And where you start on the pyramid will be dictated by the level of your course. So for example, you'll find that entry-level courses, a student may not get beyond remembering and understanding. They may just need to, especially for survey courses, they just need to be able to describe, discuss, maybe explain some of the various frameworks of forensic psychology. But since this is an intermediate course, we want to look at the middle part of the pyramid, that analyzing and the application, because when they get out of that course, we want them to be able to analyze and apply those specific models of ethical decision making and be able to take that into their future job goals. And so if you take a look at Bloom's taxonomy, we have these different levels that are illustrated from top to the bottom of the pyramid, and it gives you a short definition to help you classify your outcome within what level you think would be appropriate for the level of the course and the students and what your goals are for the course itself. So if we're looking at analyzing and applying, it says draw connections among ideas and use information in new situations. It also gives you a list of various verbs, those measurable and observable verbs, that will help you specify to what extent they will demonstrate the mastery of that concept within an assessment. So Bloom's is a great tool to have. I have it printed out and I use it every day above my desk. And there's a lot of different forms of this with, literally dozens and dozens of verbs for every single level, that if you can't find a verb that's appropriate for the level, keep looking, because there's large lists and resources available for you. So let's go back to our example. So we wrote out two different outcomes. And I want you to ask yourself, which one is measurable and observable? So the first one, option one, be aware of ethical decision-making and forensic psychology. And the second one, analyze and apply models of ethical decision-making processes to forensic professional settings. And one thing I've heard from students before is sometimes the longest answer is usually the rightest. So course outcome option one is not measurable and observable. Why? So we first of all have the be aware of is one of those soft, unmeasurable verbs. They can, I can be aware of, a certain policy, but not be able to explain it. But, to what level will they need to understand or apply that outcome? It's also not specific to the context in which they'll have to be aware of this decision-making process within forensic psychology. And that's why option two is a lot more measurable and observable, because we're getting them to analyze and apply models of ethical decision-making processes to forensic professional settings. And as as we go through this webinar, we'll see how we can take that outcome and break it not only into objectives, but also align assessments that are relevant to how they're going to be analyzing and applying those models and processes. So take just a quick moment, and I can go back to Bloom's in just a second, but try to choose a measurable and observable verb that matches up with the level of your course outcome and the level of your course. And I'll just go back to this just for a minute so that you can review and maybe see some of the verbs that they provide. All right, I know I'm not giving you a whole lot of time to write these down, but I will be sending out this PowerPoint following the webinar, and you can have this Bloom's resource as you're writing your outcomes and objectives, and we'll return to this graphic a couple more times in this presentation. So now that you've started thinking about these measurable and observable verbs for your course outcomes, and hopefully you've determined maybe the level of Bloom's that you want students to achieve with that outcome, we're now going to turn it to objectives, and I'm going to turn it to my lovely co-host, Courtney Hebert.
In working with instructors and professors, we often find that they are much more familiar with the learning objectives for their course and less familiar with course outcomes. Course outcomes tend to be program driven or already written for you, but we want to make sure that you understand the difference between course outcomes and learning objectives for your course. So learning objectives you can think of as stepping stones to get to your course outcome. And they're a way that you can sequence and structure the topics in your course in order to provide a clear path for students to go from that bottom level, that remember level, all the way up to the higher level order thinking, which is probably where your course outcomes are going to live. So they not only sequence, but they're also supporting your course outcomes and the higher level thinking. If you can think about the learning objectives or deconstructed parts of your overall course outcome.
So now that we've worked to develop that outcome, we're going to break it apart. Not destroy it, but just break it into its constituent parts.
So let's talk a little bit about learning objectives and how we write those. So learning objectives, we always want to make sure that they're connecting to our course outcomes. We should see a clear line between a learning objective and a course outcome. They're always tied specifically to an assessment so that we make sure that we can measure it in a specific and relevant way. And we want to write these to be student facing. So it should be from the student perspective. You may see examples that say, teach forensic ethical decision making, but we want to write our learning objectives from the student perspective. So what do you want your students to be able to do by the end of this module or this class? And in that way, you can make sure that you are able to measure that. My student was able to do that, or my student wasn't able to do that. And so we have a formula that is very helpful in writing these learning objectives. We start with that same action verb that we use for our course outcomes. So we'll go back to Bloom's in a second, but remember we always want to use a measurable action verb. The second part is the noun, or I like to think about it as the topic. What exactly are we describing? What is the topic or the course topic that you're covering? And then that last part is the context. When are they doing this? How are they doing this? To what degree are they doing this? So if you cut it off at the 7 steps of a research process, that could mean a lot of different things in a lot of different scenarios and at a lot of different levels. But when we contextualize it when writing a paper, that makes it much more clear to the student and to the assessor exactly what needs to be accomplished. So using this formula equals a specific measurable learning objective that students will know exactly what they need to complete, and the instructor will know exactly what they need to measure.
And your outcomes, you can use the exact same formula for your outcomes as well. But just keeping in mind that your outcomes are going to be those broader destinations or goals that are achieved by the learning objectives.
So let's take another look at Bloom's, and we can use Bloom's in our learning objectives, just like we used it in our course outcomes, to write those measurable learning objectives. Here we're looking at it in a little bit of a different way. Remember when Lydia said that your course outcomes may be in those higher order level thinking skills. You might be applying and analyzing. You may even go as high as evaluating and creating for some of your course outcomes. But before students can get to that create, they first need to remember and understand. We can't create before we can remember. So very handy thing about Bloom's is that it not only provides us with the verbs, but it provides us with the scaffolding that our students need to get from one thinking level to a higher thinking level. So if you want your students to get to that apply level, your learning objectives should start with the remember level and then go to the understand level. And then your course outcome might be an apply. So this is a great way to think about the hierarchy of what your learning objectives can be and how that scaffolds up to your specific course outcomes.
And one thing to note, it doesn't necessarily have to follow in sequential order from remembering to understanding to applying to analyzing, but just keep in mind that if your outcome is an analyze, that your course objectives, that your module objectives should be at that level or below. It shouldn't be above, because again, we want to build towards that skill.
It's also going to depend on the level of your course. If you're teaching an introductory level course, you might need to start at that remember. But if your students are coming in with some prerequisite knowledge or pre-knowledge about the subject matter, you may be able to skip remember or do some type of pre-assessment to make sure that they remember, and you can go to that understand and that apply levels instead of starting at the remember level. So it has to be customized for your specific course and the level. So we're going to look again at our forensic psychology example. The course outcome that we chose is analyze and apply models of ethical decision making. And we have two sets of module learning objectives here. So take a moment to read them. And remember that we're looking for not only measurable and observable and specific module learning objectives, but we're looking for objectives that scaffold up to the course outcome.
And by scaffolding, it's basically providing that, that way that they can build towards that larger goal or outcome.
Okay, so I'll start with the first set. So summarize the development of forensic psychology in the 21st century. That's still an appropriate, measurable objective. There's nothing wrong with the objective itself. However, it doesn't match up with our course outcome. So our course outcome is about ethical decision making, not about the development of forensic psychology in the 21st century. Know the difference between and grasp the significance of. Those verbs could definitely be more specific, more measurable if we use Bloom's. And again, we're talking about forensic psychologists. The third one starts to go into ethical decision making, but that whole list of learning objectives should really be taking our students through that hierarchy of knowledge, and so that they can get to analyzing and applying models. Versus the second group of learning objectives, you can see that they start at a lower level. First, they are going to identify models. Then they're going to examine them, and finally they're going to compare and contrast them. And those are specifically about decision-making models. So it's that scaffolding that I was talking about, where you go from the bottom of the pyramid to the top, so that by the end of that module, I know that they can analyze and apply models of decision making.
And one thing to note here, we've just chosen one outcome, and your course should have more than one outcome, hopefully. If it's a three-credit course, there's usually anywhere from 3 to 5 to 6 outcomes. And so just because one of your objectives doesn't match up with your outcomes doesn't mean you can't use that objective, and doesn't mean that you shouldn't be assessing that objective. You may just need to go back to step 1 and either add an outcome or maybe revise one of the outcomes that you've stated. Another thing, outcomes can be assessed throughout different modules. Though it can be really easy to set it up where Module 1 assesses and helps them build towards Outcome 1, you can work through different outcomes in various modules, so they don't have to be tied to one explicit module. So we know that that first set of examples is probably not appropriate, is not aligned to our course outcome that we chose.
We think it's very important that you share your course outcomes and your learning objectives with your students so that they have a good understanding of exactly what is expected of them. So this is showing you one example of the way that we provide our students with the course outcomes and learning objectives. In the syllabus, which is the left side of your screen, we have a listing of the course outcomes that the students should achieve by the end of that course. And we also include all of the module learning objectives within the module. So students sort of can't get away from it. You know, it's always very obvious and relevant to the student why they're doing what they're doing, what's expected of them, especially in online learning. Not knowing expectations is a really huge barrier for students and can cause students to drop out and non-complete. So we want to make sure that what is expected of our students is very clear and obvious for them. So this is one suggestion for how you can share your course outcomes and your learning objectives with your students. Just to summarize what we talked about, outcomes and objectives, for your outcomes, you're gonna start with those broader course goals, and then you're gonna deconstruct that into your, into your learning objectives for each module of your course, making sure that your course outcomes and your learning objectives are both measurable and observable and are tied to at least one specific assessment within your course. Using Bloom's taxonomy is a great strategy or a great tool to make sure that you do that.
So now take a quick moment and look at that outcome that you wrote with a observable and measurable action verb, and think about how you would break that into 2 or more objectives. What are the stepping stones to get to that final destination to achieve that final goal? All right, in the sake of time, I'm gonna move on to assessments, but again, you'll have hopefully a little bit of time to think about this overall alignment strategy towards the end. Next, we're gonna move on to assessments, which you should be asking yourself once you've looked at your outcomes and your objectives, how will students demonstrate this mastery of the knowledge, skills, and abilities that you outlined in both your objectives and in your outcomes? And assessments are really measurements of ways that we can determine whether or not a student has mastered something. And you should also be thinking, how can you use something called formative assessments, which are assessments that help students check in with their learning and help them achieve those higher level thinking skills to build towards those summative assessments or those cumulative final exams, the final projects that, that align more closely with the course outcomes. So some tips, again, you want to use the verbs in Bloom's taxonomy and in your objectives to guide the types of assessments that you align to your objectives and your outcomes. And just like we want to scaffold or build towards our outcomes with the objectives, your assessments ideally will also do this. You shouldn't expect students to be able to write a fully formed research paper if you haven't built-in activities that help them get the practice and the skills and the concepts that they will need in order to be successful with that. So just a quick reminder of the 2 major types of assessments that may be within your course. Formative assessments are assessments that check for students' understanding of key concepts. They're a checkpoint both for instructors to see how students are progressing towards achieving those learning objectives within the module. And they also help students give a self-check for how are they doing with the course content. Do they maybe need to rethink their study strategy or take better notes in class? So the goal of a formative assessment is to monitor student learning and provide ongoing feedback that can be used by both instructors to improve their teaching and by students to improve their learning. And they really help students identify their strengths and weaknesses and their target areas that they may need to do a little bit more work, and then also help you realize where students may be struggling and address a problem immediately before it becomes an issue. So formative assessments include, we have a range of different activities that we suggest within Moodle, one of which is a lesson that I find many faculty members haven't had much experience with or haven't seen at all. A lesson is a series of pages that allow students to, in a low stakes environment, practice or get hands-on scenario-based practice with a concept or a skill. Another formative assessment could be a quiz where, maybe they take a short quiz on the reading and make sure that they understand how it fits into the context of the module. They get immediate feedback on it, and if they fail the quiz, then that gives them an indication that they probably needed to read more closely or re-examine how their strategy. Other formative activities could be a discussion forum where students are discussing those major concepts within the module, maybe with other classmates. But a formative assessment is basically any other practice activity or homework, usually contained within one module that assesses the objectives within that module. And you may find that you need to use more than one formative assessment to achieve and assess each of the stated learning objectives within the module. So examples of formative assessments built out in Moodle. This is what it looks like to students. These are the various placeholders for the lesson, quizzes, forums, and assignments that students may work through. And this would be an example of one of those short auto-graded quizzes that helps give students immediate feedback about their own learning. The other type of assessment are your summative assessments, and these are going to focus more on the outcome of the entire course, maybe even the program. And these are something that are present in most courses by nature. Sometimes the courses only contain summative assessments in the form of a midterm and a final. And we find that a lot of students who take those kind of courses that have only high-stake assessments, there's a pretty high chance of them not being as successful as they want it to be because they haven't had that opportunity to assess their own learning with those formative assessments. Other types of summative assessments could be research papers, projects, or presentations. So when you're thinking about your summative assessments, look back at your outcomes. How can you use your outcomes and specifically those verbs to reflect the type of final assessment that they'll have to do at the culmination of the course, that represents the culmination of their knowledge, understanding, and acquisition of the skills throughout the course. Another consideration, if you do have a large project or a large summative assessment, consider building in those check-in points throughout the course. So my example with the research paper, maybe instead of just submitting a final draft at the end, midway through they're submitting their topic and getting feedback from you. They submit a rough draft and get feedback from their classmates. They submit an outline. That way, there's lower stakes chances for them to correct their own learning and ultimately produce a better final product and a better outcome of the course.
For summative assessments as well, it can be helpful to think about authentic types of assessments. What are students going to be doing once they leave your class, once they get into their job? Once they move on to grad school, what are the key actually authentic, real world, practical tasks that they're going to be expected to do on a regular or daily basis, and create some type of project around that so students can see the alignment or link between your course and their actual real life.
So an example of a summative assessment, this was actually one for a graphic design course. that surveys the history of graphic design. So in this final research project, they're researching a specific designer or movement within graphic design, but they're also producing it in a form that allows them to apply graphic design skills to design their paper to look like the period or designer that they're researching on. So, and this actually gets a lot of really good reception from students. They produce these very well-written research papers that also look really fantastic and illustrate those principles of design that are exhibited by the designer they're writing on. So not only do they get to write about them, but they also get to apply, well, what is their style? What does that look like when I'm trying to produce a document on them? And again, when you're thinking about those formative and summative assessments, go back to Bloom's. Formative assessments are more than likely going to be towards the lower end of that pyramid. Not to say that all formative assessments will be at the lower level and all summative assessments will be at the top, but you want to think about having your formative assessments build towards those larger goals of your summative assessments and by extension, your course outcomes as well. So let's go back to our objectives. How are we going to assess these? So we have identify decision-making models, examine components, and comparing and contrasting. So for identify, it's most appropriate to have these be kind of low-stakes quizzes, lessons, or forums where they are choosing from a multiple choice set of options, or maybe responding to a scenario and identifying what model is being used in that scenario. For examine, it's a little bit more involved because it's a higher tier on that pyramid. So when they're examining components of decision-making models, they wouldn't necessarily be able to do that in a multiple choice quiz. Instead, they may have to respond to questions in a forum, review a case study, and provide a written assignment or summary of the decision-making model examining those components. And then finally, comparing and contrasting in the same vein, a little bit higher level than just identifying. So find ways that you can meet students where they are on those lower levels, have those quick quizzes, and then they move on to those more involved assessments that require them to analyze, apply, create, evaluate, so on and so forth. So what are the formative assessments we're going to use? For Module 1, I want them to take a quiz where they're reviewing a case study and identifying what is the most appropriate decision-making model that could be relevant to the scenario. They'll get immediate feedback on it and know, do I need to go back and review those different models again and make sure that I'm understanding them the way that they're presented. And then I want to do another formative assessment that is working them a little bit further up that pyramid, where I'm getting them to discuss in a forum the components of ethical decision-making model applied to a scenario you have encountered. And there I'm not only getting them to move up that next level in Bloom's, but I'm also getting them to connect it to something they've experienced before, which is, I think, really, really important, and it can help motivate students as well. Because it's one thing, students love talking about themselves, I know we all do, but it can be helpful if they can connect the material with something they've already experienced. For that summative assessment for this course, I want them to create a case report on a given ethical scenario. And not necessarily, it could still just be a rigorous research paper, but they're gonna have to do a case report in the real world if they pursue a career in this field. And within this case report, they're comparing and contrasting roles, analyzing ethical conflicts, and applying an appropriate decision-making model. And this might be something that they have to do in the real world. So not only does this summative assessment align with the course outcomes, and not only do the module objectives prepare them for the summative assessment, but again, as Courtney said, it is authentic. It is something that they may find themselves doing, maybe not formally in the field, but this is a decision-making process that they would have to go through should they pursue a career in this field. So again, a couple of best practices. Integrate those regular formative assessments to help students monitor their learning. Find ways to create opportunities for individualized instructor feedback at major points in the course, especially when it comes to those larger projects or papers that you may have them doing for a summative assessment. And whenever possible, utilize those authentic assessments based on real world applications of your course concepts. So think very briefly, think of maybe one appropriate summative and one appropriate formative assessment to pair with your outcome and objective. It could just be, I want to do a quiz, I'd like to do a discussion forum. And again, it all depends on the level of the course and what you're teaching. A math course is probably not going to have too many discussion forums, and they're probably not going to write a paper. So again, you have to tailor it to what is most appropriate for your course. All right, next we're going to move on to activities and content, which is where you end up spending the most of your time producing for your course. Writing outcomes and objectives and even determining assessments shouldn't take, well, I say shouldn't, but they won't take up the majority of your time. It's the activities and the content that will really is where you dedicate most of your time in teaching and facilitating the course. And these should also be aligned with objectives and assessments. So activities are ways that students can get practice or engage with the material before being assessed on it. Activities can also include assessments, meaning that an activity could be a discussion forum where they're engaging with other students, and maybe you give them a discussion forum grade because they are being assessed on an objective within that module. But it can still be an activity because they're getting practice and they're getting a creative way to interact with the material. You also want to make sure that it's relevant and appropriate for the topic and the level of the course. And wherever possible, try to bring in multimedia, especially in an online environment. Videos, simulations, discussion forums, group projects. These are all ways that you can actively engage your students. And then the content. So these are your instructional materials, your textbook. It could be the third-party website. It could be your lectures in class. It could be the videos that you provide online. And the content also supports the acquisition of learning objectives. They should also be relevant and appropriate for the level of the course. And with the content, the strategy is sequencing and chunking the content in a way that supports the acquisition of those objectives and makes sense to the learner. So just like we talked about with scaffolding and the outcomes and the objectives and the assessments, your content and activity should also provide the support for each step along the way. And the content is really where you can integrate your voice as an instructor. If you're teaching in person, I hope you're literally integrating your voice in that, they're listening to your lectures and participating in your in-class activities. But there's also some varied opportunities for integrating your voice in an online environment where they may not be attending a class that you are giving live every single week. So I wanted to show you some examples of some activities that I've used in some of the previous courses that I've worked with. This goes back to that graphic design course. Like I said, it's a survey of the history, and they start very, very early on with early visual representations in human history. And they read a section of the textbook, they get a couple of videos, and then they have the opportunity to actually tour the Lascaux caves. You can walk through each of the rooms and basically use your mouse as if it were your eyes and explore the typography, not the typography, but the layout of the cave and actually see the scale and the sort of grandeur of these wonderful visual images. And students, it's not necessarily an activity that they'll be tested on, the Hall of the Bulls was the third room from the entry, but no, it gives them a way to engage with the material in a more dynamic way. Another example of an activity that is also partially an assessment, within that first discussion forum, they're not only learning about visual representation systems, but the evolution of written language. And so taking what they know about the different written languages in early cultures, they actually had the opportunity to create their own personal hieroglyph based on the principles of those early written language systems. So they have to upload a picture of their personal hieroglyph and then support how does it fall into these early written language systems. So again, it's a creative way. Yes, they're still being assessed on those objectives, and we're still getting to that final endpoint, but they're getting to do something again that connects with them personally. And it's those types of touches that will make your course memorable for students.
If you're interested in including something like the Hall of the Bulls visual, like Lydia just mentioned, you might try searching for virtual field trips in your specific content areas. So that's basically what that was. And many museums and governmental agencies have these free for use on the internet. So that's an option for further engagement and learning for your students.
Now, as far as content, especially in the online modality, there's a vast variety of resources that you can provide your students. One of the main resources that we use in our LSU online courses is a book that is situated within Moodle itself. And that's where the instructor would provide written context to accompany visuals. You can also embed videos to really give a student a rich range of content to support the acquisition of those objectives.
So we've talked about a lot of different parts, a lot of different pieces to this puzzle. How do you put it all together? How do you organize it for your specific course? What's the best way to start doing all of this? One tool that we use to help visualize and organize the alignment of a course from start to finish is called an alignment map. And we're going to go ahead and show you an example of one we use. So here you can see the different areas and the different pieces of the puzzle that we talked about today. We have space specifically to list our course outcomes, our learning objectives, assessments, activities, and instructional materials. The benefit of using an alignment map such as this, or one similar that maybe fits your needs better, is that you can clearly see the horizontal alignment between the objectives, assessments, activities, etc. So what we're going to do is we're going to show you an example of how we put our model class that we use today throughout the webinar actually into this alignment map.
And through the magic of television.
So we've gone ahead and we've entered in our course outcome there at the top. Our module is ethical decision-making models. We've listed our 3 learning objectives that we decided on, and all of those learning objectives correlate and associate specifically with course outcome 1. My assessments are listed, and after my assessment, I have what learning objective is being assessed in that assessment. In the activities, I'm detailing the type of activity a student is going to go through, and again, what learning objective is that associated with. The same thing with the instructional materials.
And this way you can make sure that even on the point-by-point level, the types of instructional materials, that all of your objectives are covered. And if they aren't, you see a gap and you can identify, okay, I need to go and find a better resource to help support the acquisition of this objective.
Exactly. So I can easily see that in my assessments, a forum is assessing learning objective 3, and that's an appropriate type of assessment. And all 3 of my learning objectives are assessed in that assessments column. So it's just an easy way to check, quick way to check and a quick way to align your course.
And we will provide it won't be as colorful, it'll just be a blank Word document using this alignment map that you can use to map out your own course. So before we close out the webinar, I wanted to discuss your unique course value. And again, this is that essence of you as a professor, those major concepts that 5 years down the road, students remember, oh yeah, we did that really, really cool activity that I was able to connect something we learned to something in my personal life, or this is something that I still think about in everyday life, or I see examples of it wherever I go. So what is the value of your course to students? What are the key features of your course that demonstrate your unique perspective or teaching style? And then how will you translate this for the online environment? And online can be especially tricky because you aren't there directing the class in a lecture setting every single week. However, there are a lot of opportunities for interactive activities, real world applications that you can integrate into your course. And as far as your own voice, for example, we have these wonderful Zoom webinars that we can use. I'm recording it now, and I'm going to be sending this out to anyone who couldn't attend the webinar. This is where you can also step in as an instructor and provide guidance, provide context, show your enthusiasm, show your face, so that students, though they may not be seeing you in your classroom every day, they will be seeing you online. So there's a lot of ways that you can preserve this unique course value and translate it to the online environment. So putting it all together, wrapping it up into one beautiful aligned bow. When a course is properly aligned, those critical course components, your outcomes, your objectives, assessments, activities, and materials work together throughout the course to achieve that desired learning outcome. As an instructor, when your objectives are specific, measurable, and observable, and then properly aligned to those assessments, and those assessments are supported by relevant and appropriate activities and course materials, you have a clear line of evidence as to whether or not students have achieved the learning outcomes. And on the flip side, students can see very clearly that the course materials, the activities that I'm doing, the assessments that I'm taking, match up with those outcomes and those learning objectives. So everyone benefits in the end from alignment. So at the end of this webinar, I want you to maybe once the webinar has closed, take a minute to reflect and try to apply those major objectives that we determined at the beginning of this webinar. So write one measurable, observable, and relevant course outcome. Then work to deconstruct that outcome into measurable and specific module learning objectives. From there, start thinking about what types of assessments would be appropriate for those objectives. Write down a couple of ideas for formative and summative assessments in your course. And then take a few minutes to reflect and write some sentences on what your unique course value is. What are those major experiences that you want students to have, and how are you going to translate that into this next offering of the course? How will your course design and materials support this unique course value? So at this point, I will open it up for a little while for a couple of questions if anyone has some. You can use the chat feature or just unmute yourself and ask away. Not all at once, guys. Well, if there are no questions, and again, I'll give you a short opportunity if y'all are just thinking of things now. Oh, I think we have one that came in. Okay. I'm glad everyone thought it was helpful. I hope we gave you a new perspective on alignment, because it can be something that people always hear about and kind of roll their eyes. Oh, I know about alignment, but it can always be helpful to get a reminder. So just a note, we will send out a public link to the recording of this webinar along with a template for the alignment map that you can use. Feel free to share this with your colleagues. This is not trade secrets for LSU Online. These are best practices. And if you are joining this webinar because you're participating with us currently in course development, or you're going through the special focus program, you'll receive specific instructions on what to do with those activities, those different points that we asked you to write out following the webinar. But until then, thank you for your time and attention, and we'll see you on the internet.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.